There are a lot of teams around the country right now that you don't really know about because they lost games early, and so their reputation's already, oh no, it's kind of pushed to the side. North Carolina is one of those teams. And I'm going to talk about several of them here that I think we need to be really careful just discounting wholesale because they've, I don't know, lost a football game, which tends to happen. Keep in mind, you need to view these teams within the proper context. Right now, there is no giant out there. Like last year, it was Alabama. And so if you lost a game or you even looked weak, everyone looked at you, and in the context of the playoff, they said, this team could never beat that team, forget about this team. Well, that's no way to think about college football to begin with, but secondly, we don't have a 2020 Alabama. We don't have a 2019 LSU out there anywhere, waiting in the wings to destroy you. And so it's a more wide open field, which stands to reason and stands to mean don't be discounting people just because they lose a game. So what about North Carolina? They lose on the road at Virginia Tech. It's a really tough place to play in week one. The road in general has not been kind, in case you haven't noticed, for a lot of even really talented teams early in the season, because a lot of your kids haven't played in true road environments. And so when we look at North Carolina, yeah, they've lost a game. Well, they rebounded nicely. They've played a couple of games, especially last week against Virginia, where the offense that you didn't see in week one finally showed up. I'm always very hesitant in discounting these teams that have as much potential firepower as North Carolina has. And so you've got Sam Howell there. You've got a staff that knows how to get it done offensively. The big question there has become, are they either going to be good enough or opportunistic enough defensively to end up stringing a little stretch together here that, for instance, could have already started last week, to where all of a sudden you're looking up in, let's say, mid-October when they're playing Florida State and Miami, and all of a sudden you find yourself saying, wow, this team's really hit its stride. You know it's coming. You know there are going to be one or two or three of these teams that we're about to talk about that hit a stride. It happens every year. This year will be no different. North Carolina could be one of those teams, and if they are, that's the kind of team that you find yourself in November looking at and saying, wow, no one wants to play them, or I wish we would have caught them earlier in the year. Keep an eye on North Carolina. Got like a massive hiccup here. Trying to keep it suppressed, though. Another team that I want you to look at is the University of Texas. Texas, the moment you saw them get run out of the building by Arkansas, was a team that a lot of people dismissed. And Texas has no business being dismissed yet. That Arkansas game, what I want you to do is not forget about it. I want you to remember it, but I want you to bookmark it, because we need to come back to it in a few weeks for some proper context. Just as sometimes a win is overinflated, like Alabama over Miami week one, you don't think as highly of that win anymore. Well, sometimes a loss can have the same kind of impact. You look at a loss to Arkansas, a team that maybe at the time you didn't think highly of, and you say, Texas, y'all can't even get it done against Arkansas, forget about you. Well, then you end up looking back and you say, well, first off, it turns out you should have known that night. Not many teams would have gone into that building in that environment and won. But then B, maybe down the road you're saying, it's not a bad team they lost to. And since then, they have validated a lot of my preseason expectation about him. Casey Thompson has worked his way into a groove now that he is the starting quarterback there. And that's the kind of thing you could find yourself saying about Texas. But I'll tell you, now that they've lost a game, I think a lot of the white-hot spotlight is on them. We've already seen the quarterback switch that, to be honest with you, I was scared of, but it's happened, so you got to roll with it now. They're about to enter conference play this week. They got past food last week. They blanked Rice. So now they play Texas Tech. I'm going to talk about that game a little bit later on, but look at that stretch. Texas Tech at TCU, against Oklahoma, obviously in Dallas. Then they got Oklahoma State at Baylor, at Iowa State. This doesn't get any easier. That's what we know, part one. Part two is we know Texas is good enough to win all those games. Texas is always going to be a team too talented enough to totally discount just because they have one loss on their resume. This is a team that has hit its stride, put on a kind of winning streak potential under its belt. We'll see if they're able to pull it out at any stretch. Up the road, and I mean a good ways up the road, in the Big 12, Iowa State. I've got, obviously, emotional attachment here. Every season, Iowa State or anyone else carries with it certain outliers. For our purposes, a lot of times when we get to the postseason grade time for our model, a lot of times I like to run simultaneous or concurrent model runs, postseason model runs. One of them just takes every bit of data into account, and then one is a margin shaver. And so what I do is I like to shave off the top and the bottom. Some of you had teachers like that back in the day. They would take your worst grade off of your final report card. Well, I do that, but I also take your best grade off, and I think the real you is somewhere in between there. Well, those are outliers. Iowa State obviously had an outlier of a game already. It just so happened to come on the biggest stage. It came against Iowa. They were -4 turnovers. You look at the box score, you look at the post-game win expectancy, stuff that doesn't really matter at the end of the day, but it does matter in terms of future-looking predictability. And it said Iowa State should have won the game. Well, they didn't because they choked, because they turned the ball over. Or, alternately, yeah, Iowa forced turnovers. You could also put it that way. Nevertheless, Iowa State has largely been dismissed because of that. You shouldn't dismiss them yet. They went on the road, albeit to UNLV. So they got right last week, had one of those classic get-right games. This is a figure skater of a team. You watch figure skating, and believe me, I am the world's foremost expert on that craft. And I was always fascinated how, if you're a figure skater and you got all your arms extended and everything, but then you slowly draw them in, you start speeding up, the spin rate starts speeding up. Iowa has to do the whole compacted speed spin, and I'm sure that's the technical terminology, for the rest of the season. They can't get loose. They can't have any parts of their operation get loose. But we've seen them go on that kind of run before. And just because they have a loss right now, we need to also take into account all of their springboard games, potentially, are still in front of them. They've still got at Kansas State, but you're looking a little ways down the road. They've got Texas. They've got Oklahoma. You potentially have a Big 12 championship game. All the mechanisms that they need to get their name back in this race, they're still down the road. And the other thing with all these teams to keep in mind is it's an inevitability any year, but especially this year, that they're going to have teams ahead of them losing. So there are going to be some of these teams that you have even forgotten about as late as mid-October that end up getting back in very consequential conference and playoff races. What about USC? I was going to spend a whole lot more time on the Trojans tonight, but unfortunately, about 2 hours ago, it was revealed via USCfootball.com. Our folks out there on the West Coast revealed that Jackson Dart had a procedure, minor in nature, but a surgical procedure. I think it was on a meniscus, and so he's going to be out a few weeks. Now, it wasn't menisci, which would be both of them. It's just meniscus, so it's not the plural, it's the singular. But it looks like he's going to be out a little while. And that is consequential because Jackson Dart was the backup quarterback that came off the bench this past week and really took it to Washington State. Looked really good. Jackson Dart's a guy all the way back to the spring that we had been talking about. And in the summertime, we had been talking about him and how it really looked like in the first few weeks of fall camp, he was emerging as a legitimate candidate to play this year. Turns out he ended up getting his shot, and he took advantage of it, but he also got hurt. So I don't know where they're going to be right now. USC, if they had the services of Jackson Dart, which is a guy I ultimately felt was going to give them the best chance to win, even then, they've already fired a head coach. You got quarterback, I won't say turnover, but you had some shuffling of the chairs there. At the best, USC was going to be kind of like if you ever played video games as a kid and you put the controllers and everything up, and inevitably when you pull it back out, all the wires are tangled up. And so you try to go slow and untangle them. But eventually, you just shake them violently in hopes that you shake it just the right way where all the cords come undone and everything's nice and neat. That is USC this year. I want to see them get one violent shake and maybe everything separates and maybe everything just falls into place. It's hard to envision that now that Jackson Dart's gone down. Crazier things have happened. I think there is two ways you can go when you fire a coach. Either everything goes into the tank or you find out that maybe there were guys in the locker room that respond positively to that move, and then there's a gelling collectively, and you just see a culture quantum leap. I don't know what it's going to do there because we've only seen one game, but that's something to keep an eye on. But across town, UCLA is another one. There's this duality of college football going on with UCLA right now. You saw them beat LSU, but then you most recently saw them lose to Fresno State, and the whole duality is I got some folks who were yelling from the mountaintops last week, Fresno's really solid. They could upset UCLA, watch out. Well, then they did it. And the same person will tell you, oh, UCLA's done. They can't even beat Fresno. It's like, did they lose to a really good team or did they not? Because you were telling me last week, that's no team to shake a stick at now. Fresno, pretty good. Oh, you lost to Fresno? Yeah, they lost to Fresno. It's a really good team. This is not a UCLA team that we're talking about within the context of are they or are they not top 5 material? Are they or are they not a really solid football team? I think they're a really solid football team. I think I underrated them coming into the season. And the point is, much as is the case with Iowa State, much as is the case with Texas, they got a loss on their early season resume. It's not even a conference loss. They've got everything in front of them, too. I think UCLA has the most challenging conference schedule out of any of those Pac-12 South teams, but they hadn't played a single game yet. USC's already fired a head coach. Utah's already lost a couple of games. And so who knows how that shakes out. But North Carolina, Texas, Iowa State, USC, UCLA, be very careful just dismissing these teams in this kind of environment just because they lost a game. Can you imagine going back to 2007? If you had dismissed every team that lost a game, it turned out that year you couldn't even afford to dismiss teams that lost 2 games because a 2-loss team in LSU won the national championship. So be careful, friends. Don't get fooled. Get fooled once, don't get fooled again.